Hey, everybody. I hope this finds you well. This is a lecture on note taking strategies. We're going to talk about how to take notes when you're listening to a video, and how to take notes when you're reading a textbook, and how to take notes when you're listening to a lecture like in class. Okay, so let's start with video. Well, actually, let's start with generic tips for note taking. So think about what are things you want to listen for when you are doing something that requires notes. If you are not an auditory learner, which I am not, taking notes can be very difficult because you are trying to learn by listening, but also write down main ideas at the same time, perhaps even writing down things that you don't understand or you're hearing for the first time. So it can be a really stressful thing, and becoming a good note taker is part of being successful in college. So let's talk about what to listen for. So in your notes, you want to write down listen for. And we want to talk about listening for some cues. Like if I say, I'm going to give you 3 ways to take notes, then obviously you can write down in your notes 1, 2, 3 and fill it in as I go. So you want to listen for any numbers. You want to listen for repetition. If your instructor or whoever you're listening to continues to repeat ideas, then probably that's a main idea. You want to listen for emphasis. So if there's a big pause or if your instructor gets louder, things like that would be emphasis. You want to look at body language as well. Is your professor using their fingers like point one? Is your professor really emphasizing with hands? Okay, so those are the cues you're going to listen for. You also want to listen for any reference to an assignment, quiz, or exam. So, of course, if your professor says, listen up, this is going to be on the next exam, then you need to write that down. So, we want to listen for references to other course assignments. Even things like if you're in unit 2 and your professor says, back in unit 1, we learned blah, blah, blah. In your notes, you can write unit 1 reminder and to separate, like this part of the lecture is a reference to unit 1. The rest of the lecture is from unit 2. So you want to listen for references to other course material. Of course, you want to write down anything your professor is writing down. So I'm writing this down, so you should be writing it down. A lot of times professors randomly write down things. So I found in college I'd be writing down everything that was on the board, but then still being confused when I got home. So I'm going to give you a tip on how to solve that problem today. So write down anything the prof writes down. I wonder if y'all remember projector notes and transparencies. That's how I did take all my math notes in high school. Makes me feel pretty old. And even in college, some of my professors used transparencies, and some of my professors didn't use anything. They spoke the entire lecture time, and it was up to me to figure out what to write down. So, another really, really, really important part of listening to a live lecture in person. So, if we were in person, you could stop me and say, like, can you clarify? Is being a self advocate in the classroom, raising your hand and saying, can you clarify this? I'm not sure I understand that. Can you repeat this? So, ask questions is really important. Now, what kind of questions are you going to ask? I just verbally told you some, but I'm going to write some down so that you have it in your notes. You can ask for clarification. You can ask for repetition. You can ask for explanation, like further explanation. You can ask for a textbook reference. A professor might be talking about Unit 2, and you can raise your hand and say, what pages in my textbook or what chapter are you talking about? So ask for specific connections to your other course materials. You can ask for definitions. Don't be afraid to say you don't know what a certain word means. I guarantee there's somebody else in the class who doesn't know but doesn't want to ask. Not all professors, I want you to keep this in mind, not all professors are trained in teaching pedagogies. So you have professors who are all experts in the content field, but you might have a professor who never took a teaching pedagogy class, like how to give students notes or how to ask students questions. You might have a professor that literally went from bachelor's to PhD in their content area with very little teaching. Now, obviously, PhDs who are your professors have teaching experience, but their training and their coursework might not necessarily be in teaching. So that's why, as a trained teacher, I'm trying to give you some of these strategies to interact with professors who may not have teaching pedagogy background. So, when I'm teaching, I look for body language cues from students. I obviously can't do that right now, which is a downfall of online learning, but I so I look for student confusion cues. And I also, as I'm speaking, try to think of words that I'm saying that I expect the students to know that maybe they don't, and I'll go back and define it. So, for example, if I say, we're struggling with institutionalized racism in this country, I'm going to stop and say, raise your hand and tell me what institutionalized racism is. Because if not everyone in the class knows what that means, then I'm missing a big part of my content. But a lot of professors aren't trained to stop and define. So it's really important to ask your professors for definitions. Like, if you hear a professor say systemic police brutality, if you don't know what that means, then you should ask. Okay. So those are questions to ask your professor. All right, now let's talk about video. One of the most important parts of being able to watch a video is being able to pause it and rewind it. You might also be able to put the closed captioning on and look for all the other things that we just took notes on. Perhaps in the video text comes up like a vocabulary word. Obviously, you're going to write that down. So for video, you have the ability to pause, you have the ability to rewind, you have the ability to rewatch. Look for the closed caption, look for other cues that we talked about earlier, and look for any text pop-ups. Also, if you are watching a lecture video, like for example, my lecture video, if I start going through a PowerPoint, probably a good idea to write down notes from that PowerPoint, especially if your professor is not posting the PowerPoint. All right, we talked about what to do for live lecture, what to look for. I'm going to give you some note-taking strategies on that in a minute. Oh, and then in this situation where we're not interacting, you would want to look for any written text like I'm popping up to you, emphasis, repetition, all the things that we just took notes on. So note-taking strategies, think about some of the ways you take notes. Do you list things? Do you bullet things? Do you do a web? Do you do an outline? Okay. So, the webbing idea, I can't do this. I love this strategy, but I can't do it because literally you're going to see my webs just get too crazy looking. Webbing is a creative way to do outlining. So in this particular example, your main idea would be here. You have two sub ideas under this idea, two details under this idea, same here. And then you just keep going. So the further down you go, the more specific you're getting. So by the time you get here, you might be putting a quote in here from a source. Okay. Here might be your explanation. Here might be an example. Okay. So, you have the webbing idea, which I'm sure you all know. You've got Venn diagram for similarities and differences. Okay, remember that. You put the similarities in the middle and the differences on the side. That could be an important thing for looking at a potential topic to write about. You know, looking at both sides and thinking about what the background is on both sides. You might do an outline, which lucky you, um, Microsoft Word predicts when you're going to do an outline as soon as you do a capital Roman numeral. And so all you need to do is press enter and tab as many times as you need to do the outline. So Microsoft Word is really great for outlining. I'm trying to remember, I'm pretty sure it goes like this. All right, so you might have Roman numeral 1, main idea 1, 2, 3. Main ideas under B, you might have your explanations, you might have 2 examples of support, and you might put here where you got those examples of support. Outlining is a very important step in the writing process because it keeps you super organized and focused. And a lot of times I find with my freshman writers, they struggle to stay focused on main ideas. All right, the last note-taking strategy I want to talk about is the Cornell note-taking method. You may have heard of it. I do want you to Google it after this lecture. Google Cornell note-taking method. There's a whole bunch of different ways to do it. And I'm going to give you a way that works for like a lecture that I'm giving, or if I assign you something to listen to and watch, this is a good note-taking strategy for that. So in your notebook, you're going to draw a little table. Question. Okay, so here's one way to organize your notes. You can put the date of either, like you could put today's date if you're taking notes on my lecture. If you watch the Obama lecture, you might put the date that was posted, and then the title of the lecture. So for example, if you're taking notes right now, you might put note-taking strategies. Over on the left-hand side, any key vocabulary terms you're going to write down here. You don't need to write the definitions because you might write a page number of the textbook if your professor says this is on page 20. And this is for going back later and looking up definitions because you obviously can't keep up with writing every single word that your professor says. So when they mention or in a video, if any key vocab is mentioned, write it down here and do the definitions later. Questions. This box is for any questions you have during the lecture that you might email your professor later or ask to stay after class and clarify. You might take these questions to a tutor. You might Google these questions. You might find the answers to these questions in your textbook. So this is for you to keep track as you're listening to things that you're confused about, because if you don't write down any questions during the lecture, after the lecture, you're going to forget that you didn't have clarification. So you want to make sure you're keeping track of what you have questions about. And then over here in this big block is all the key ideas. So anything else you think is super important, put it here. And then I talked earlier about giving you a key to make sure you understood a lecture. That's going to be this part down here, which is if you're able to write a 2 to 4 sentence summary of a lecture or a video that you just listened to or watched, then that probably means you got it, right? But if you go to the summary part and you can't write the summary, then you better pursue some of these questions with your professor or your textbook. An example of in my life of where I have failed in the summary is I will take all of these notes from a math lecture or even like a physics lecture or something like that. And the summary part at the end of the day, I'm like, I I don't I don't really know how to encapsulate this lecture. So, a solution would be email your professor, ask some questions, and then ask your professor, can you summarize your lecture in 2 sentences for me for my notes? Okay. Or if you can meet during office hours, that's always a good thing to ask is for your professor to summarize a chapter or summarize a unit. Might be a good challenge for your professor as well. All right, so that Cornell note-taking method is tried and true. It's been taught from elementary school up through college. And the reason is because all of those things, when we have a visual to separate categories, when we can like pre-compartmentalize a lecture, then we're not just listening and writing down random notes and looking at our notes later like, what the hell was I writing about? Okay. So when you already have an organizational structure, then your brain isn't struggling to categorize. Because when you're having auditory input that your brain knows you're going to need to access later, your brain is trying to categorize it like, how do I access this later? Am I going to put it in the vocab box? Am I going to put it in the questions box? So if you already have that laid out, your brain can relax and take in the auditory input and process it a lot better. Okay. So let's talk about taking notes from your textbook. Okay. All of the stuff I just blabbered on about can apply to textbook note taking. Yeah. But most of the stuff we just talked about was for any verbal auditory situation. So let's talk about how do you take notes when you're looking at your textbook. Now, when I assign you readings in the textbook, I say read chapter 1 with notes. Those notes are for you. I don't need to see those notes. If you want to email me your notes and say, like, does this cover chapter 1 appropriately? Did I catch all of the main points? Of course, I can look at your notes, but I don't need you to upload them. I do expect you to take notes simply because we are going to be learning a lot of very specific course vocabulary terms. So anything that is emphasized and stressed in the textbook, you might come on up here, honey. I have a child that's loose. She might make an appearance. Anyway, so when you're looking at our textbook, you want to, it's organized very nicely with subheadings and things like that. I also will be talking to you via lecture about what's important. So I'm going to give you some general tips for textbook note taking, no matter what kind of textbook it is. Okay. So think about what types of things to look for. Take a minute to think, how would you take notes from a textbook? Let's say you're a peer tutor and you are teaching a peer how to take notes. What would you specifically recommend? Anything that's emphasized, like bold, underline, italics. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, can you guys clean it up? Sorry, just hold on one second. Okay, back downstairs and clean that up. Okay, go clean up. go clean up. Looks like my child spilled an entire bin of cat litter. Hold on a second. Okay. So for textbook, you're looking for bolded, underline, italics terms. You're looking for the headings and subheadings. You know, before you even read, I suggest some skimming, because when you skim, your brain is going to pick up on these bolded terms that are pointed out. And when you actually read, your brain will activate like, oh, I need to pay attention to this because I already skimmed it and I see that this is a main point. A lot of textbooks have tables and graphics. Pay attention to anything like that. Pay attention to any separate text boxes. Okay. And paying attention to all of these things and writing them down is what's called active reading and active note taking. So it means that your brain is engaged with the material more so than if you just skim and you're done with it, or more so than if you read it one time and try to, get away with not taking any notes. All right, so look at the separate text boxes. You want to look at any notes in the margin. Some textbooks will have separate notes in a margin that relate directly to the main content. Okay, so I'm going to hold this up for a few more seconds so that you can write it all down. You want to make sure you avoid textbook fatigue. A lot of times professors are like, read chapter 1, and chapter 1 is 40 pages of tiny text. You need to make sure you're taking breaks. And that's part of the beauty of having a textbook. You can always take a break and come back to it, almost like a recorded lecture where you can pause it, come back to it, or rewatch it. Okay, so some important end of lecture notes here are rewatch, reread, and for a lecture that you're listening to in person, make sure you follow up with the professor if you need to. These are your especially special tools. Can you give that to mommy? Bring that to mommy. One more second. Yes, mommy. Okay. So that's our lecture on note-taking strategies. Sorry about the interruptions. I know you understand, and I'll see you next time.